If you are worried about not being able to absorb more than 30 grams of protein per sitting, here's a simple solution. Stand up, get another plate, sit back down and eat another 30 grams. Problem solved. Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. I thought I would chat with you guys and gals a little bit about this today. So this is one of those things where this comes up a lot still, and it blows my mind that anyone even discusses this in 2024, right? It's one of those topics to where you're like, are you people even old enough to remember when the magazines were writing this nonsense? In the modern era, all the best experts laugh at it, debunk it, and plenty of studies have debunked it. Like to the point to where people are going in just to do their doctoral work so they have something to do it on, to where they're making studies to debunk it and showing it's nonsense again because it used to be a really old myth 25 years ago. Okay? People need to understand that. That's how much of a nonsense joke it was. There are people who, let me do something for my quick doctoral work. Let me do this for my thesis and test it in the lab and then make fun of this. That's pretty much where we are. So for anyone who's still mentioning this, I don't know, because I'm seeing this online in groups and in questions, and I'm like, these are younger people. Like, how do you guys even know about this? This is something that died a decade or more ago. It was completely laughed into non-existence. So I don't know where younger people are even hearing it from. So the whole idea, though, was that, as far as muscle growth, or first it was absorption, then it was muscle growth. Keeping in mind when people say, the science didn't say this. People in bodybuilding magazines said this. This was not something that had been demonstrated in a lab. And people need to understand that just because something is a hypothesis that someone's postulated and never tested, okay, that's not scientific at all. That's just someone coming up with a theory or a hypothesis. Okay, this was never demonstrated. Okay, this is not something that was ever studied and demonstrated in a laboratory. So we need to be clear on that. It's not science. This is magazine writers from the 80s saying, hey, and why did they say it? Does anyone know the origin? So they could sell more protein shakes, because if you can only absorb 30 grams of protein in a sitting, or 25, notice it's coincidentally right about or a hair above what a scoop of whey is. Does anyone notice that? Keeping in mind, this is not a scientific statement. This is an industry statement. It just so happens that, a scoop of whey, depending upon, the brand or whatever, tends to be about 22 to 26 grams of protein, and the cap is 30, right? Does anyone think that's a coincidence? That this myth came up 30, 40 years ago? It was used to sell protein powders. That's the only reason this myth was created. It was never scientific. But the idea was that, we can only absorb this in a sitting, so we need it in separate meals. Okay, nonsense. It was to sell protein shakes so that people would get all that protein 5 or 6 times a day. Okay, it was never based on reality. This was never something that leading experts around the world and PhDs were putting out data on. Supplement salesmen were writing articles on this. So this is, first of all, nonsense. But the absorption thing, does anyone actually think the human body works that way? Protein was relatively hard to get historically. Contrary to the myths, that these cavemen ate nothing but meat and our ancestors, that's all nonsense. That's been debunked. That's nonsense. Protein was pretty hard to get in large quantities. And when we did tend to get, so let's say we go to animals. You do know that your ancestors didn't get meat every day, like large amounts of meat. It was something that maybe the tribe ran down a giant big game, and then everyone gorged on it, and it might be a few days or a week before they got any real serious meat again. So all that protein was eaten in one go. They didn't have refrigerators. Even modern curing methods didn't really happen until people had access to larger quantities of meat. It all got eaten. Within a couple hours, all of it was gone, always. Okay? This is how we've absorbed all the large quantities of protein for pretty much all of human existence of our species. And if we notice, the human GI tract is really efficient at utilizing protein. It doesn't like to waste it. Okay, so what we've noticed, before we get into muscle protein synthesis studies, we've noticed this forever. There's an upward limit to how much protein, depending upon the protein type. Keeping in mind, different protein types matter here. Particularly get into stuff like whey protein is fast. This is never a concern. Certain other proteins you might only be able to absorb 8 to 10 grams an hour. But what happens? I've said this for a decade, but all these studies even back then were showing that you just keep absorbing it. It's just a trickle down. In other words, if you eat a huge amount of meat, you don't absorb it all in the first day sometimes. You're sometimes absorbing it still the next day. And every hour you're getting a little less protein, but you're still getting an absorption of it. So even if you're exceeding your hourly absorption, it's staying in your gut a while. Again, when you eat a pound of meat or a pound and a half of meat, you don't absorb and digest the whole thing in like 4 hours and just pass through. Right? You're not expelling it in your poop usually the same day you eat. Has anyone noticed that? Just make a note of that. You eat a piece of rare steak or something, and notice if you see a little bit later in there, it's not the same day you ate it. Right? All right. So there's that, and we know that you will eventually get it. Now, people say, but so there's a limit, then it could be 8 or 10 grams or whatever an hour. Yeah, but how many of you how much protein are you guys eating? Okay, how much are you eating? If we're going over about 200 grams a day, I think you're probably okay still on your protein needs for muscle growth, right? But here's the point people make, well, what about for muscle protein synthesis? Well, that's been studied. In fact, another study was done just this year on it, measuring just that. Why was it done? Because people need to do something to get their PhD, so they need to study something. They get grant funding. This is what I want to study. So that's where a lot of these nutrition and exercise science studies come from for lifting purposes, because they're not big enough to do real PhDs in. So these areas. So for a lot of them, for lifting purposes and all this is people's doctoral work to get their PhD. So what they find, that when 100 grams of protein is eaten versus 50, it still produced a greater increase in muscle protein synthesis. Okay, documented right there. 100 grams did more than 50. Well, those are both like more than 30. Notice that it didn't give a bigger spike so much as it just maintained it longer. In other words, it just kept muscle protein synthesis elevated longer. That's all that happens. When you eat more protein in one meal, the only thing that happens is that you get about the same amount you would on a smaller amount, but it just sustains it longer, which makes sense when you look at the fact that it takes longer to digest and absorb. That's it. That's all that happens. Right? This is what we see in the lab. This is what basic biology, this is what basic common sense says. And the entire other hypothesis was completely fabricated entirely for the purpose of selling you supplements. It was always a scam. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys and gals next time.